Okay, welcome to the follow-on video from the first historical fisheries video, which was pre-colonial. We're going to be talking about colonial to present day now, and we can divide it into phases based on sort of numbers of people, technological developments that caused major changes in fisheries and the way fisheries were done, the technology that was used, and the scale of fisheries, all the way up to the present. So, in the early colonial phase, which is the first one, 1840 to 1870, as you can imagine, there were only small populations of Europeans here. And so the first little populations were small scale, had a limited need for fish, and no way to store it without any refrigeration technology. And so it was really just fishing for small amounts, as much as you could eat before the fish went off. And there were cottage industries, mostly developed by Maori. Generally, netting and line fishing were the methods, and there were plenty of fish around, so you really didn't need to go very far from a settlement, and you didn't need to go way offshore either. Generally, shallow coastal waters and small catches. Of course, without a depletion of the resource, there was plenty of fish to go around. And so, of course, you didn't need to get a license. You didn't need to buy quota or follow any regulations. You just went out and fished if you wanted to, and sold the fish if you could. So, the early colonial phase, 1840 to 1870, we didn't have refrigeration. So the only way to extend the life of the fish was to smoke it, cure it with salt, or dry it. And during this time, Europeans kept arriving, the population increased, and so a few of those Europeans obviously started commercial fishing. Again, no fisheries legislation, no administration, no regulation by the government, leading to scenes like this, where anybody who wanted to would just go fish off the rocks, catch some quite nice snapper with a hand line or a net, and then bring them, sell them door to door or market in the small villages. We move on to the early industrial phase from the early colonial phase, and we start moving into a little bit larger scale. More people had been arriving. Few fishing companies evolved, and they started canning fish. So canning fish allowed greater preservation and a really almost unlimited preservation time. You can can something, and as long as the can doesn't corrode, then you should be able to eat that product 2 or 3 years later, and it should still be fine. So they even started exporting to Australia and back to Europe. And the company Sanford still survives today. We'll see scenes, you would have seen scenes like this, small boats with no motors, possibly a sail, going out, netting fish, close to coast, and close to coastal communities. Just near shore fish. Mullet were a big one for canning. Netting and longlining and dredging for oysters and mussels became more common techniques. And the coastal shipping, mostly developed for mail, was also used to distribute fish around. So places with a lot of fish, like Stewart Island, and places like Dunedin, you could ship oysters and fish to Dunedin. You could fish them from Stewart. You could send them from places like Stewart Island with very healthy populations of fish. And the one of the things that allowed the early industrial phase to and during the early industrial phase, one of the things that allowed the fishery to ramp up in scale was ice makers. With the advent of refrigeration, uh, New Zealand farmers could move from just sending wool back to Europe to sending wool and meat. And so this is when freezing works were established, and they just decided, or they were able to use those freezing works not only for meat but also for fish. And so this was allowed preservation of the fish, and they were able to export it in larger amounts. So they started sending it to Australia and even to England, and then we noticed for the first time local depletion of certain species, oysters especially. And if you read a book called Hooked, The Story of New Zealand Fisheries, that's a very good book that can give you some information on this era. And so the government became involved with the depletion. It couldn't be a free-for-all anymore, so they started limiting net sizes, fish sizes, and started closing seasons, originally with oysters, but then also with fish. They set up a ministry for marine and marine fisheries. With it was concerned with conservation, but also developing the industry. So conservation meant not depleting fisheries locally, but hopefully expanding them out to other parts that were not so commonly fished. And so during this period, with the expansion of these small companies, the resource use was expanded beyond local consumption to exports. So that is the end of the early industrial phase, and we will talk about after turn of the 20th century on the next video.